Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Moshe Maimon, and we'll be discussing the Piyut of Rav Yehuda HaLevi, the author of the Kuzari, called Mi Komocha Adon Chazacha, which is said by the Svardim on the week before Purim, so Shabbos Parsha Zachar. So thank you, Moshe, for joining me once again.
Thank you very much for having me. Always a pleasure to be with you and your many, many listeners. Always a pleasure.
Okay, so let's talk about this piyut. Some listeners may be, hearing for this piyut first time. They have no idea what the piyut is. So, I'm actually let's mention the piyut a little bit, and then we'll talk about Rav Yehuda HaLevi for a little.
Okay, so this piyut, which popularly known as the piyut of Mi Komocha, it was so popular that in some Sephardic communities, especially the one that I come from, the Shabbos before Purim was not called Shabbos Zachar; it was called the Shabbos of Mi Komocha, Shabbati Mi Komocha, because it was for the people in shul. This took on more of a meaning to them saying this piyut than even the laying of Parsha Zachar. So it's a very widespread meaning in the Sephardi world. We'll talk about when they said it and whether may not have even started to say it on the Shabbos before Purim, but right now the association today is this piyut is said on Shabbos Zachar by the Sephardim.
Okay, so basically, right. Well, we'll leave that just for now. Just like you said, it's a piyut by Svardim, and it's a piyut, with like all the classics of a piyut. Okay, let's talk about Rav Yehuda HaLevi a little bit. There's actually a myth, a legend as well that's associated with his history with this piyut, but we'll leave that for a minute. So first of all, just his basic background, who Rav Yehuda HaLevi was, when he lived, that kind of thing.
Okay, so the thumbline sketch of Rav Yehuda HaLevi is he was born in Spain when Spain was still known as Andalusia. It was under Muslim control, and more importantly, Muslim culture. He was born, I believe, in Toledo, Tudela. It may have been known at the time, and I think the year was about 1075. Thereabout, he's a contemporary of the Rimagash, a student of the Rif. Many people think he himself is a student of the Rif. He may have been a Talmud of the Rimagash as well. He's a Talmud Chaver of his. There's Geniza evidence that he was for a time he served as the scribe for the Rimagash. He was close to him, and he composed some of his songs after the passing of the Rimagash. So there's definitely a connection there. He grew up in, like we said, in Andalusia under the influence of Muslim culture, which included at the time for the intelligentsia, people like Rav Yehuda HaLevi. It included a thorough background in philosophy, in medicine, and also a big emphasis on linguistics, on poetry, and on grammar, and an emphasis on the Bible as well, because that was where the Jewish poets drew their inspiration from. After leaving, he left about we have him placed in Egypt in the year 1140 on his way to Eretz Yisrael. Did he get there? Did he not get there? Is a matter of dispute. A year later, we know that he was no longer alive. There is a legend that he made it to Eretz Yisrael and he was trampled by an Arab nobleman on his horse right when he got there. Most likely that's a romanticized account with little basis in history, but it is pretty much established that he was dead about a year after he had left Eretz Yisrael.
Right, and obviously he's famously known for authoring the Sefer Kuzari, and also for many, many, many piyutim, poems, and the like. So this is probably, interesting. I would say this is the most famous one, but I don't know about Ashkenazim. This may not be. They may be more familiar with this kinnis. May not be so familiar with this one. So yeah,
I would. I'm going to tease a publication of mine that's about to come out. It's an article that it's just about ready to go to print, which is from the Pirush on Chumash. It's a fragment from the Pirush on Chumash of Reb David HaNogid, the last of the line of the Negidim, sixth generation descendant of the Rambam. And this Pirush of his is a likut from earlier sources. And very intriguingly, he brings a piece there from Rav Yehuda HaLevi, which is similar to something in the Kuzari, but much more expanded upon. And there are some differences in there, which is, it's very tempting to think that Reb David HaNogid actually had a Pirush on Chumash from Rav Yehuda HaLevi, which is completely unknown until now. We know, again, like he wrote the Kuzari, which is very famous for, and a lot of songs, both Shirei Kodesh, Shirei Chayil, but a Pirush on Chumash we did not know about. So this should be a very, very interesting revelation.
Okay, right. So like I said, so this piyut. Actually, let's leave the piyut. I keep going back, but let's first talk about the interesting part of the piyut. Even though it's part of the piyut, it's part of the historical background. So I think we should discuss it now. There is a famous tradition, myth, probably I could call it that, but it's not. I guess it's not for sure a myth that the Ben Ezra, the famous Rav Ben Ezra, was Rav Yehuda HaLevi's son-in-law, and this story has its roots in this piyut. So maybe you want to relate this story and how it's connected to this piyut that we're discussing.
Likely this, there was likely a separate tradition or myth that had Rav Yehuda HaLevi being the father-in-law of Ibn Ezra. Likely this comes about, this probably started in a world where they did not know a lot of the Chachmei Andalus, aside from the very famous ones like Rav Yehuda HaLevi and Ibn Ezra, who were definitely contemporaries. They definitely crossed paths a lot. Ibn Ezra does quote Rav Yehuda HaLevi variably throughout his peers, so there's a connection there. There is no, there's no mention of any family relation, but he is mentioned there. They were friends. They definitely had a lot of contact. They come from the same place. They lived at the same time. They may have even gone, they may have even showed up at the port in Cairo at the same time, according to some Geniza evidence. But there is no evidence of any relation, of course. But there was such a legend that they were related by marriage. And likely that legend was harnessed to explain a very obvious discrepancy in this piyut, which we will get to soon, or we can get to it now.
Yeah, we probably. I mean, we should dive into it, but let's just talk about this part of the piyut. Then we'll discuss the overall piyut, the structure, how standard goes in aleph beis, what the piyut talks about. I just want to discuss this one part of the piyut. It's specifically about the ice reish, when the letter reish.
Okay, so I guess a little bit of the structure is necessary to understand this legend. The piyut is comprised of 85 stanzas, and the 85 stanzas are arranged alphabetically in 4 separate arrangements. The first one is straight through aleph beis. Then there's one that spells out Ani Yehuda HaLevi Chazak, I believe, or 4 letters there. Then again aleph beis, and then a shorter one, Ani Yehuda, or thereabouts. So in one of these, in the first, I believe it's the first one, which is a straight aleph beis, the 22 letters of aleph beis, there are 2 reishes there. Or maybe the third one. There are 2 reishes there, and that's very interesting. This probably gave rise to the following legend, which is first written down in the Shalshelas HaKabbalah, the much maligned Shalshelas HaKabbalah. But he says that Rav Yehuda HaLevi was in the middle of composing his Komocha when he got stuck on the letter Reish. And he tried and he tried and he tried, but he could not come up with a solution. And his wife was waiting to serve him his supper. And she finally sends to the Beis Medrash for him. Meanwhile, in this Beis Medrash, the Ibn Ezra showed up incognito. But he showed up there and he got close to Yehuda HaLevi, never revealing who he was, pretending to be an ignoramus. And when Rav Yehuda HaLevi finally leaves, he leaves his work table and he goes home to enjoy his dinner. So Ibn Ezra goes to look what he was doing, and he sees this poem under construction, and he says, "Oh, what's the big deal? He couldn't come up with a reish," and he writes one himself. Meanwhile, Rav Yehuda HaLevi comes back. He is already on his way back. He had an inspiration for another reish, so he put his in there. And when he discovered the other one, he figured out it must be the work of this itinerant student of his, and that's how his identity as a Talmud Chacham was revealed. And it's a little bit more romanticized in the Shalshelas HaKabbalah with the promise of who he would marry off his daughter to. But the story goes that this was the impetus for him to give his daughter's hand in marriage to the Ibn Ezra, and that's why we have the 2 reishes here.
Yeah, I was going to add. So the story goes, his wife was champering him to marry off the daughter. Wasn't married, so he swore. He made it, something that doesn't make any sense. Right. He would have done. He swore. He said he's going to marry it off to the first person that comes, with Ibn Ezra. And like you said, he made me believe he was an ignoramus, and it was terrible. There was a whole long story, and there's a whole Shalshelas HaKabbalah about. The Shalshelas HaKabbalah says this, who, like you mentioned, the much aligned, the Chida is notorious for going after him. Right. But they say that Darius does quote him, which the Chida, is a kasha, and they say that Darius. Something else about this I think is worth mentioning here. The Barbanel does quote this legend as well. So the Barbanel, but again, so I haven't mentioned this yet, but there's a brand new, beautiful edition of Komocha with the Pirish and etc. And there's a bunch of nisbachim in the back, appendices in the back. And the first one talks about the story at length and goes through the history of this. And really, it's a very, very good article, well worth reading. But I do think it's worth pointing out something else about this legend is the Shuvas Chavas Yair. Everyone knows the Chavas Yair. Rabbi Yochai and Bakrak, right? So he in Siman Reish Lamed Ches, the last tshuva in the Sefer, he brings this down. He's talking about a piyutim and how you could say piyutim middle of davening. He's talking about, and he brings down this story, and he says, so he brings down that in Shema Yischav Beis, he brings down Rav Yehuda HaLevi, and he doesn't mention that he's his father-in-law, and he says this is Mamash Tzarachin. This makes no sense. He says Menuchase covered. So he says, the Chavas Yair answers this, but he probably married his daughter after he died. So he wants to answer up the Shashalas HaKabbalah. But there's more here. You can read more in the Chavas Yair. I saw that, and there's a lot of this. This is all quoted in this Nisbach here. And Rameir Mazuz in his Sansan Yair, he has a pirish on this. He has a pirish on the Mikamaycha. He tries to answer this. That he says that they didn't know, the Rishonim didn't call by name, they didn't necessarily a kasha on him, but with the fellow, I don't know who he is, who put out this nisbach, he doesn't, he has kashas mother Rishonim on Rameir Moses. So this is a whole discussion. Obviously won't get into that. I don't know if you wanted to mention this, but he does mention here in this new edition that he actually found in the Kisvei Yad, this is fascinating, 6 different reishes. And not only that, in some Kisvei Yad, it's missing altogether. So he hypothesizes that perhaps there was no reish for whatever reason. We didn't have it, whether Rav Yehuda HaLevi didn't write it or we don't have it. So people just came and filled it in, and suddenly this legend grew up from this. But anyways, that's the historical legend about the reish. And okay, so let's get to the Piyut.
I would just add one more thing. That studying this Piyut over Shabbos, it occurred to me that the hardest stanza in the entire Piyut, and for the most part, it's pretty straightforward. All you need is a good concordancia because there's so many biblical references, obscure ones too. But if you know what the meaning of these biblical terms, it's actually pretty straightforward. It's not like a kaliri where there's all kinds of new words and new formations, new conjugations that we never knew. So it's pretty much self-understood. But this one stanza, which is attributed, which is considered the authentic reish by Rav Yehuda HaLevi, is almost incomprehensible, and which may be why the edition that you're talking about from Rabbi Yisrael Eliyahu that came out a year ago. So it's his theory that maybe there was no original reish, and that's why they were added in, which is a little bit strange. Why would there be no reish? Is that just an oversight? I think it's more likely, in my mind, that this complicated reish was just too hard for people, and so it out of necessity, some later Pythonim tried to put an easier one in there for people. That's my I don't know that for a fact, but I think that would be a more workable theory.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Piyut. Just to tease, the Piyut is, you mentioned, the 85 stanzas, but the Piyut is basically, I think of looking at it as, just what I thought of looking at it, not an expert in Piyut. It seems like almost like the Avodah on Yom Kippur, if you're familiar, it's like a retelling of what happened in a Piyut. This is the retelling of the Purim story. The first 3, the first 3 parts talk about the story, and the last one is about the mitzvahs of Purim. So, but first of all, something we should discuss is why is it called Mikamaycha Adain Chazdecha?
Okay, very good. So that Mikamaycha is actually a name of a type of piyut. And a long time ago, when piyutim were popular and well recognized, there were different kinds of piyutim for different parts of davening, and mostly in Birchas Kriya Shema, either before Shema and some after Shema. And the Mikamaycha kind of piyutim were said specifically to be said after the Mikamaycha right before Gal Yisrael. And there was a lot of such piyutim. This was a very common practice in the ancient world. In times of the Kadmonim, the Rimagash was asked about it, and he said it's okay. When the Rambam, a student of the Rimagash school, when he was asked about it, he was very, very opposed to it. He said there should be no interruptions during Birchas Kriya Shema. But the Rimagash himself says that this is widespread. He said it's ubiquitous everywhere in the world that he knows of. Piyutim are said on the special Shabbos. in the special days as well in the during the Birchas Kriya Shema. In fact, we have in the Sefer Hamaspik, it says that in Fostat, where the Rambam lived, there were two different synagogues. There were more, but two main synagogues, and one of them was the Palestinian synagogue, which finished the Torah once every 3 years, and they would say piyutim during Kriya Shema, and the Rambam was so opposed to it that he would avoid praying there. That's what he said. He couldn't stop it. He wasn't powerful enough to stop the minig, but he was very opposed to it, and he wouldn't pray there. And that's in keeping with the Rambam's tshuva, where he's opposed to it. Now, why was he so opposed to it? Did he feel that it's a halachic hefsek against the Rimagash's ruling, and which is also the Rif's ruling? Perhaps, but it's also likely that it has to do with the reason given by the tour, that it ruined the decorum of the shul. These constant interruptions. It's like all the Misha Berachs during Kriyas Torah of today, for example. And these things, people talk. There's all these interruptions. It ruins the mood. And that was a big concern of the Rambam. We know that he did away with Chazar Sashatz by Musaf for that reason. So it's possible that was another factor in his opposition. But ultimately in the Sephardic world, the Rambam's opposition is what held the day. And the Mechaber in Shulchan Aruch writes that we should not be mafsik, and Sephardim today are not mafsik. But when Rav Yehuda HaLevi wrote his Piyut, it still was pretty widespread to say Piyutim during the Birchas Kriya Shema. And one genre of those piyutim was Mikamocha. Now, Rav Yehuda HaLevi himself wrote more than one Mikamocha. I think he wrote 6 or 12. There's a whole list of them, which have fallen out of use a long, long time ago. This Mikamocha survived, and that's why it has its second name. It's Mikamocha Adon Chazdecha, because that's the opening stanza is Adon Chaz. After they say the pasuk of Mikamocha, and then the actual the aleph of the beginning of the piyut is Adon Chazdecha. So that's why it has its second name. This one survived because of its great popularity. Apparently, it was moved to the Mikamocha of Nishmas. Hafsakas during Pesukei Dezirma were still much more acceptable after they stopped being mafsik in the Birchas Kriya Shema. But then they moved it to the Nishmas, to the pasuk of Mikamocha Vir. The Chida, when he talks about this minig, he was only aware of the Nishmas minig. He doesn't know about the original minig said during Birchas Kriya Shema. So and he says that even though there's many communities that still say it during Nishmas, that's also a problem, because according to Kabbalah there should be no interruptions even in the Pesukei Dezimra, and therefore there was a movement to move it out of the Pesukei Dezimra to say it after davening, totally disassociated from any Mikamochas, and just the name is what reminds people that originally it was part of Mikamocha.
So I think your family, right, is Turkish, and I don't know if you know about other Sephardim. So when do you actually say it, and what about others, about Syrian or Moroccan? When do they actually say the Piyut?
I think most of the mainstream Sephardi shuls today will say it after Shachos, before Kriyas Torah. But there are some, I read about, there are pockets of people, of holdovers that still say it during Nishmas. I don't know of anyone that says it during Kriyas Torah. I would think that's probably obsolete, the original minig.
Right, I saw in this new edition that you mentioned, it does also mention something that people also, it was said on Purim at some point. I've ever heard of such a minig, or only on the Shabbos before Purim?
Right, so I never heard of that minig either until I read this young man's research. But apparently, if it was, I always thought like the Chida did, that it was originally invented for Nishmas, which obviously we don't have on Purim. So that's why, I had assumed it was for Shabbos before Purim. But he says that a lot of the evidence, because of its popularity, there were so many, fragments in the Gniza and other libraries and in old Sidurim that have this piyut. And the earliest evidence for this piyut indicates that it was said on Purim, in the Birchas Kriya Shema of Purim. And probably that, that imposed extra hardship on people because of all the other things they were doing on that day. But they did this. It was so beloved that they did, they made time for this.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Piyut. We mentioned it's such a beloved Piyut, and it's, it's so popular. It's maybe interesting, people listening, popular Piyut. Everyone's like Yotzers now. They go running out of shul. Nobody, or shuls don't say it. They don't go running out of shul. They don't say it anymore. Piyutim. So obviously there's something different about this Piyut, besides the fact that Rav Yehuda HaLevi wrote it. And so, like I mentioned, it's somewhat like, I'm just giving an example, people can understand, like that Avodah, it's giving you the story of the Purim story in a, Piyut form. So I think that probably is what makes it interesting. So maybe talk a little bit about the actual Piyut, like what it discusses.
Okay, so one of the things which always struck me, and I'm not a Piyut expert at all, but what always struck me is that the sheer genius of this Piyut is readily apparent to anyone just looking at it, even for a moment. And I was introducing this Piyut to my students a few weeks ago, and I told them, imagine Hashem in Shemayim, he gathered all the neshamas of all the poets and all the the great Paitanim who wrote all the Piyutim for Hasidurim throughout the generations, and he posed them with the following challenge. He said, I want you to say over the Purim story, but I want it to rhyme. And now rhyme was very popular in the Arabic world where Rav Yehuda HaLevi grew up. But in the Chumash, there's a lot of shiras which don't rhyme, and in the ancient world, shira did not necessarily, popular shiras did not rhyme. Why? Why didn't they think of it? I'm sure kids, there were always nursery rhymes, but for some reason, sophisticated prose did not have to rhyme necessarily. But in the Arabic world, it did. So let's say this is the challenge: come up with a piyut for Yom Kippur. For Purim, and rhyme it. It's got to be rhymed. There's got to be acrostics in there, so you don't have the freedom to choose your words. And I want every single stanza to end with an exact, not a paraphrase, but an exact phrase from Chumash ending with the word loy with loy to him. And I think he did a count in this recent edition that you mentioned, and there's 1,200 there are such instances in the Torah, and I want every single one to fit appropriately to the stanza and pick a pasuk with loy and rhyme it and use as many biblical references as you can. And nobody was able to do this except for Rav Yehuda HaLevi, the great genius. So when you look at this, it's astounding because it's the entire story told over beautifully and brilliantly. It's rhymed, it's witty, and there's just so many layers of meaning. The more you look into it and the more you check the references, the more beauty you see in it. So I think that's why that's the cause of its immense popularity.
Right, and now I can mention this edition, the new edition. They just called it Komocha Aden Chazara. It's literally the very, very original name of the Sefer. He just literally called it that. But he has in there, they mentioned 4 appendices, and in the beginning there's an introduction, and then throughout it he put in a lot of the sources. And there's also a long commentary. I think he culled from all the different ones that were around. I don't know. I can't say offhand right now. I don't know if it's available in the stores locally, but I'm not sure. If I find the link, I'll put it in the show's notes. But I'm not sure. The other place that I can think of offhand is besides for I guess it's Sephardi Sidurim, but in Sansan Layoyer from Amir Mazuz, which I know is around, I believe now actually, which he has it's his all his different Torah on Purim and Esther, etc. He does have in the beginning. He has this with his own commentary. I think this was like the first sefer he wrote when he was still in the Jerba. He has a facsimile in the back, and not only the new edition, he also gives you his original facsimile of this. So he has also a commentary on it.
There's another edition which is in a popular sefer, the Chazon Ovadia from Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. His sefer on Purim also has the Mikamaycha with his own commentary, mostly pointing out what the biblical references are, but it's also a nice, easy to use pirush.
Right. Okay. So now, what about some? Do you have any? I don't know if you have. You spoke about the structure and what it talks about. Do you have any examples that you wanted to highlight from the Piyut that you could point out to listeners, especially those of us that are not familiar with the Piyut?
Let's. I think we should. We've teased the Reish long enough. I think we should. Let's say some of those stanzas. That lead into that Reish situation with the double Reish. 2 out of the 6, but the two common ones, and most Sephardi Sidurim do reprint the 2 Reishes. So let's see. Let's look at that in Rabbi Mazuz's edition. It's on page 66, Samach Vav. So it starts with Kuf Keshev Rav Koshav Tzuror Hamar. Tzuror Hamar is again. So that's a Gemara reference. Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi pulls on Gemara. The Gemara says that is a hint to Mordechai. Keshev Rav Koshav Tzuror Hamar. So Mordechai listened very carefully. Misari Say Hamelach HaKavuim Lishmar, from the king's servants who were there to guard. And hear them thinking or planning and plotting about the king, saying, Hava Nischak Malay. So the Hava Nischak Malay is from Parai's words, there's the ending, the biblical ending. And then, so then here's the next verse. This Reish is pretty straightforward. This is the one they say is Ibn Ezra's Reish. Ratza ha'echad lishmar kiflayim. One of them suggested, let me watch both terms, because the Gemara, this is another reference to Gemara where each one they didn't really overlap, but in order for one of them to be able to carry out the plot, the other is going to have to watch both of those periods. So Ratzach and Lishmar Kiflaim Mishmartai u'mishmeres chavero shtei yadayim. He was going to watch double. V'asheni sam b'sefel hamayim. And the other was going to place in the pitcher of water some light. That's what he was going to put there, sam, poison. The next resh, this is I believe the hardest stanza in the Piyut. Rachasha Esther lamelech be'imrei shefer. Esther told the king these very important words. B'shem Mordechai v'nichtav b'sefer. In the name of Mordechai, and he wrote it down. Bukash v'nimtza lifnei tzvi ofer. They checked and they found it before a young deer. Kibul harem yisulo, that he was going to, they were going to give him the growth of the mountain. Which is it's just so ambiguous what this means here. There's actually the oldest commentary on this stanza belongs to the Tzror Hamor, no less Avram Saba. He says that he believes that and we have not found a midrashic source for this. It doesn't rule out that there was one, but Avram Saba says he believes that the way they tested the water was by giving it to one of the, to an animal in the king's zoo there, a young deer, and the deer died. So they realized that this was not an innocent herb, but rather some poison that grows on the mountain. That's his shot. There's others, but it just very, very, very ambiguous, and that's I think the most ambiguous. The result is a shin shneim nitlu ala eitz. The two sarisim were hanged. Shama Mordechai lishonam behivaetz. Mordechai was able to understand what they were saying. Nashkel hamelech sam hamavet roetz. Let us feed the king the poison, debilitating poison. Ulay yifutev v'nuchlalo. Maybe he will take it and we will overcome him. Tishuazot tzifuna l'dor acharon. This salvation was what is stayed hidden away for a future generation. Nichtava al sefer hazikaron. It was written in the king's sefer hazikrones. Liyos loimen hamelech tagmul v'yisron. That the person who did this deserves to be paid. Ki po'al adam yishalem lo. Because, and that's a pasuk in Iyov, a person deserves to be paid for his good deeds. That's a good sampling, I think. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a good sampling. And then just to point out the last one. So then this is the first three stanza prok, whatever you want to call them, go through the story. The last one is interesting because it's about the mitzvahs. It talks about ichlu reim shisu v'shichru. Sorry, it talks about the mitzvahs of Purim that we have on Purim. I don't know if you wanted to mention some of those, but it's short. I don't have to go through all of it. It's not so long, and that talks about the various mitzvahs that we have on Purim.
I will. Yeah, let me get to that in 1 minute. There's one here that this to me is interesting. Because shortly thereafter, I'll get to that one in a minute. But there's one here which I think, a few stanzas later, which I think I found a hint for it in the Ramban, in the Parshat Shalach. I just found this today, and I think it shows that the Ramban, which is likely that he did, but I think he was influenced by what he heard in the shul, which they probably did the Komocha in his shul, like they did throughout at the time the Spanish in Muslim world. So let's look at the next right. So in the second set, which spells out Rav Yehuda HaLevi Akatan B'Rebbe Shmuel HaLevi. So the Yud there says, we'll go to Nun. Nimna Mordechai miskod LaRasha. Mordechai would not bow down to the wicked one. Who is this wicked one? Nin Amalek Asher mibet and Pasha. He is a descendant of Amalek who was evil right from the start. Bezeh hosif al chatato pesha. This descendant of his added to his sinful nature. Lo yoiva Hashem saloach lo. Hashem would not forgive him. I think the lo yoiva Hashem saloach lo is going back on Amalek, like it says, milchama Hashem Amalek midor dar, Amalek midor dar. Hashem has a milchama forever. Lo yoiva Hashem saloach lo. The next stanza, Yom koru le kalav de hamelach, u'Mordechai betumay oilech. Everybody else would be bowed down. Mordechai would keep on going without bowing. So Haman bikesh l'charcher riv al am dal v'helech. That made Haman want to attack the entire downtrodden nation. And then he quotes a pasuk from Mishlei. Oiver misaber al riv loy loy. He was starting in anger and a fight for no reason. A fight that was not his. Now, this just hit me today looking at the Ramban right at the end of the Parashas B'Shalach. He says, why is it that Amalek merits this terrible this sentence that they're forever, they've got to be eradicated forever and ever? So the first answer, he says, is because everybody else, this is the famous answer, everybody else, Shamu and Yergazan, all the other nations were fearful and frightened. after Kriyas Yamsuf. But Amalek didn't care. He didn't care, and that's why it says Lo Yarei Elokim. He didn't have any fear of Hashem. And then he adds the last sentence over here. V'oid kihu nin Esav. He is a descendant of Esav. Now the word nin here is unusual because the biblical nin means any descendants, and Amalek is a grandson of Esav, which would more typically be called a nechet. Yeah, but he says nin kihu nin Esav v'karev lanu, and he's related to us. Over misaber al riv loy loy, and he quotes that same pasuk in Mishlei. So I think first of all the use of nin, which was used by Rav Yehuda HaLevi, say nin Amalek Hashem bet and Pasha, and also the reference to over misaber al riv loy loy. I think that's a giveaway that of the piyut you heard in the shul that morning. Okay, so now let me get on to right at the end. You said about there is actually an interesting yeshiva shechiddush here where he starts talking about the mitzvah yom, and this is the last. He starts again Ani Yehuda, and the Aleph says Ichlu reim shesu v'shichlu. Friends, brothers, eat and drink and be merry. V'imei hapurim b'simcha shimru, and watch the days of Purim always in happiness. V'im simcha, and now we want to talk about matanos lavyim. V'im simchaschem. But always remember the paupers, the poor people, while you're rejoicing. The shilchu manois le'ein nochen loy. A pasuk in Nehemiah, which is talking about about Rosh Hashanah at the time, but it says shilchu manois le'ein nochen loy. Send gifts to those who don't have it. So you see that he gets here matanos lavyonim, im simchaschem avyonim zichru, and then he also throws in Mishleach Manos using a pasuk which says give monies to people who don't have. And Rabbi Mazuz points out, and I think Rabbi Vadia also does that. Very interestingly, there's a Truma Sadesh. The Achrayim always clear. What is the reason for the mitzvah of Mishleach Manos? And they find out, is it just to be Mar Bereus, to make more friendship, more happiness? It's part of the joy of Yom Tov that we rejoice with our friends. And the Truma Sadeshin puts forth that he thinks that Mishleach Manos is to make sure that even people who may not be poor, per se, they don't get Matanis Lavyanim, but they may not also have enough to have a good, joyful Purim Seudah. So that's why by making sure that there's Mishleach Manos, everybody's giving presents. This way we may know that everybody's taken care of. And it seems that Rav Yehuda HaLevi already, they're supporting the Rishonim for this position because it says Shilchu Manos, Ein Nachanle, uses the pasuk that say give gifts to those who don't have. So apparently Rav Yehuda HaLevi was also understanding that the purpose of Mishleach Manos is to make sure that everybody has.
Not sure if the Shalach Manos today, some of the Shalach Manos that we give out will qualify as that when we give like these little bottle of schnapps or some little small fancy cake or something. I don't know if it'll, but yeah, very interesting that he actually, like you said, you can point it out from there. And also fascinating Ramban that you pointed out. And so we can see, I was going to ask you, we can see that there were Rishayim, and I'm sure there were Achronim as well, there were Mushba, they had Ashpa from this, and they were obviously learning and engaging with this piyut.
It's true, and not only that, this piyut spawned a whole genre of melitza. You'll find it in Sfardish Forum. You'll see that they will use melitzas, which are taken from this poem. They'll use rhymes and melitza that I recognize as coming straight from this poem because it was so widespread. I'll mention one more thing. If you mine this poem and you check the biblical references, you can actually, you can see how he learned certain psukim. And one example, which I point out in the notes on Rav Rambam, it's almost at the end of the point of this, like we said, I'll interrupt myself. The point of this poem was, like we said, it was inserted by the Komocha, and it connected the theme of the day with the theme of the Brichas Kriyishma, which is Mitzrayim. It's Mitzrayim. So at the end of the poem, the last set of stanzas here talk about Yetzias Mitzrayim. He switches over to talk about the Nes of Kriyas Yamsuf, and that's how it fits in. So he started with all the Nisim of Purim, and then he says Nisim happen all the time, and from this Nes we can appreciate the Nes of Kriyas Yamsuf. And then in his discussion of Kriyas Yamsuf, I think an interesting an observation here. There's the pasuk in the Shira is Tzalkai Feres Mayim Adirim, and there's the Medrash, the Gemara says the Tzalkai Feres B'Mayim, they sank in the water. Who did? The Adirim, the powerful Egyptians, sank in the water. So Adirim means the Egyptians. But Pashtanim, like Ezra and Rav Rambam, they say that Adirim, and Rashbam as well, Adirim means the Mayim Adirim. It's an adjective describing the waters as being very powerful. So I see here Rav Yehuda HaLevi in his poem, he chooses to go with the pshat, not with the medrash. Right at the end, the Dalid, Daharais Abirim Ba'adirim Naf. The powerful horsemen, the Adirim Naflu. they fell in the mighty waters. So you see clearly he's learning Adirim like Ben Ezra and the Rashbam.
Okay, so it's definitely a fascinating piyut. So for those of us, I keep saying us, but I'm assuming most listeners Ashkenazi. Maybe I shouldn't assume that, but that's what I'm assuming. So for those that aren't familiar with the piyut, I mean, should someone pick up the piyut and go through it, especially with these different new additions that we mentioned? Can there be what? I mean, I'm gonna ask you this, but like we already know the answer because I'm like, what can be gained from it? Why should someone pick it up and learn it? You've kind of explained why, but maybe you have something more to add to that.
I think everybody will, on Purim, there's some time, in the morning before all the festivities start up, or maybe at night. If somebody wants to get into the spirit of Purim, I think this is just it's a fascinating adventure. It's easy, it's profound, and it rhymes, and it's beautiful, and it's a genius. And it's not, even though it's 85 stanzas, you can put a little, you can set it to your own little rhythm, to your own little poem. It'll take you 15 minutes, 20 minutes. And you can really, really enjoy it. And then if something catches you, everybody's got their favorite Purim varts, something about Mordechai, something about Esther. You can always find stuff in there. I've done that for a long time. I've made a living doing that. People can always find things in there. So I think I think anybody who tries it will be happy they did.
Okay, now finally, I have to ask you, being that everyone knows, I mean, if not everyone knows, I'll mention it, that you're the editor of the Rambam and Rambam. You did the new edition of Reisha Shmois and the Maimon and the Haggadah. They're all available for purchase. We did a podcast about the Haggadah, an episode way back. Is there any Purim Torah, anything specific from Rambam and Rambam, Purim related, that you wanted to mention?
It's interesting. Anyone who, I tell it to anyone who will listen, of course. But there is one at the end of Parshas B'Shalach about, I put it in the notes there. This has a nice little history. There's a famous statement from Rav Yoshe Ber, Rav, where he says either the name of his father, sometimes he said the name of his grandfather, that Amalek is, the way he said it best, is Amalek is not a nation. Amalek is a notion. Amalek is not just a tribe of Amalek genetically determined by the descendants of Esav, but rather it's people who subscribe to a certain ideology. It's the notion of fighting against Hashem and his chosen people. And any nation that decides to fight against Hashem and his chosen people, anyone who subscribes to that notion becomes Amalek. And accordingly, Timcha Zecher Amalek means not to wipe out a specific nation, but it means to wipe out this notion. You've got to counter that notion. And this is pretty common. Rav Shefter says it over him now. Yanak and others, Geshuni said it's pretty common. On the other hand, in Brisk and in Eretz Yisrael, they vigorously opposed to such a thing. Can't be. Reb Chaim never said it. There's a halacha. There's a din. Amalek. And they can't be. They're very opposed to it. But the truth of the matter is, even if Reb Chaim didn't say it, but we know the Chavetz Chaim said something similar. Reb Chanan Wasserman says that he heard from the mouth of the Chavetz Chaim, that if we had the ability to go and fight the Bolsheviks, who were largely Jewish, we would have to fight them because they're Amalek. They espouse Amalek's ideology. We would have to fight them. So you have this dichotomy there, and I found support, Reb Nachum Eliezer Rabinovich in his Shuvas. He was asked about this by soldiers. Is there a mitzvah of when we fight the Arabs, so we fight the enemies of the Jewish nation, should we have in mind to do the mitzvah of Mechias Amalek because they have the ideology of Amalek? And he was very strenuous. He said, if Reb Chaim said it, it's a Divrei Agoda. Divrei Agoda you can't mix into the Tchum of Halacha. There's nothing doing. So I found, interestingly enough, in the Ibn Ezra and Rabbi Rambam also goes this way, that in the end of B'Shalach, which is what we read on Purim morning, the Parsha of Amalek on Purim morning, it says, "Vayachlish Yeshua es Amalek ve'as Amoy leficharav." He wiped, he weakened them and defeated, conquered Amalek and his nation. So what does that mean? So Ibn Ezra says either it means Amalek is the name of the king and Amalek is the people and the nation of Amalek, Amalek ve'as Amoy, or he says, and this would seem to make more sense because we know the king of Amalek is Agag, not Amalek. Or he says Amalek is the nation of Amalek, and Amoy are people who joined the fight. People, he made a coalition to attack the Jewish nation. So according to this pshat, Reb Chaim's or Chavetz Chaim's, it's not just Jewish anymore. This is the Ibn Ezra's pshat in the pasuk. Amalek, it was the nation of Amalek who we have to vanquish, and there's also as Amoy, those who joined the fight of Amalek. So I like to say that over on Purim.
Okay, very nice. And like I said, I'll try to find, if I can find, actually, I'll say it like this. If I find any links to either of the editions, you mentioned the Chazon Ovadia or the Sansan Lior Ramazuz or this other one, Mikamach, I'll try to link it. But if not, they could just, the Sephardi Siddur should have it, right? Any Sephardi
Yeah.
Siddur should have it. You can just pick it up there. And now, one final thing is that you mentioned that you have a forthcoming article. Is there anything new that you're working on that you want, like that you wanted to mention to the listeners?
In the course of my work on the Pirush, there were a lot of different fragments of Rabbi Avram ben Rambam and others, and his father-in-law, Rabbi Chanal ben Shmuel. There's a lot of Geniza fragments that deal with the Parshanas. There's a lot of leftover, pieces on, not on Chumash per se, but there is a lot of Parshanut in Rabbeinu Avram ben Rambam's other writings, in his Chuvas and Hamasbik, and in the Hamasbik on Musar and the Hamasbik on Tefillah. So I have still a dream at this point, but I've been doing some work on it. I want to collate all these different materials, the Geniza fragments from his circle down to Reb David HaNagid, as well as a leakage from his own Pirushim. I want to put that all together as a supplementary volume, maybe, other commentaries from Rambam and his circle. That's something that would really.
All right, interesting. And thanks for joining me to talk about the Piyut.
Wonderful, Machi. Thank you very much again for having me. It's always a pleasure, and I wish everybody a wonderful Purim, and I hope somebody takes me up on the suggestion. I hope some of our Ashkenazi brethren could appreciate the genius and beauty of Rav Yehuda HaLevi's Mi Komocha.
Okay, Freilich and Purim.